Okay. So here we are. Ready to start. Welcome. Even though the temple is very crowded due to Mother's Day, happy Mother's Day to everyone, it's quite empty, the lecture hall. Nevertheless, an audience of one is an audience of one. So, that's a shame too. It's a pretty good lecture today. Or at least I would think so. All right. So, the title of this lecture is How Do We Respond to Craving, right? And the middle path is a path to fullness. Whoops, sorry. All right. So, let's start off with a simple idea, right? First basic idea of Buddhism, okay? And it's the first noble truth too, right? But before we even make that conclusion, let's explore what happens when you're born, right? And why is the first noble truth what it is? Our bodies, right, by virtue of being alive, and like just a living organism, just being alive, being present, right? According to biology, we're always trying to achieve something called homeostasis or equilibrium, right? It's like almost like the story of Goldilocks, right? Things can't be too hot, too cold, too soft, too hard, etc., etc. We're always looking for something that's just right for our bodies, physically anyway. So from the day that we're born to the day that we die, we're constantly searching for that state, okay? And you want to think about it like this. Our bodies, right? We need to maintain temperature. If it's too hot, we find AC, or we find a way to cool down. Too cold, we put some layers on. Great. Our bodies always need sleep. If you're sleepy, guess what? Your body shuts down. Period, point blank. If you slept for too long, guess what? Nobody can sleep longer than whatever amount of time that they have. They're going to wake up, right? If you're thirsty, what happens? You go seek thirst. You seek water. If you're hungry, you can only be driven to eat, right? And if you've eaten enough, guess what? No matter how delicious the food is, your body will not eat anymore, right? So, on a deep biological level, and you want to reflect on what is it that newborn babies do? When they're born, guess what? They cry. Great. What are they crying about? The same thing that we just talked about. They're too hot, too cold. Like this is the first time out of the stomach, so they're not being taken care of, right? So they're probably cold. And then they're probably hungry. And they probably need the comfort and the warmth, right? So the second we're born, our bodies need equilibrium, okay? And that's just on a physical level, right? Our basic needs on a physical level. But then you grow up in society. And when you start growing up, you start having other needs as well, right? All of a sudden, emotional safety is needed. Esteem needs are needed. Satisfaction needs are needed. Connection needs are needed, right? All these things that, as a baby you had no idea about. Now all of a sudden as you grow up, go through schooling, etc., and make friends, make connections with other people, adults in your lives, all of a sudden, all these other things pop up, right? But they're also the things that make you human in nature, right? It's the thing that separates us from animals. Animals are simply on instincts, right? They're on autopilot. They're not necessarily thinking. Or we don't know if they're thinking. We don't know if they have thought. They're simply existing, right? Whereas humans, at the very least, we know we're thinking because we have this special gift of language. We could communicate. And because we can communicate, we are more social And we're more social creatures than animals to some extent. But there are some animals that do operate as social creatures, right? So we have relationships, we work in teams, we build up society, we build cities, we construct stories, we trade commodities, we have networks, we create technology, we have advancements, we send people to space, to the moon, right? We have all these things that we've done, right? This is what society has created, right? As a function of us being social, right? And so, inherent in living is always a constant need to maintain. You gotta think about this as a fact of life, right? Which is, the second you're born, you have a need to maintain, right? And as you grow older, there's a more need to maintain because you're gonna find deficits in you, right? That's why people take vitamins, right? Or medicine, because there are certain deficits that are not registered, okay? And so, on the physical level, we have needs that we're trying to maintain. On the social level, on the emotional level, on the psychological level, we have needs that we're trying to maintain. So, when you think about it, there's a tension that's always existing there, right? There's always going to be a need, and there's always going to be you trying to satisfy that need. Hence, to some extent, the first noble truth, that life is suffering, especially when you view it as, I have a need, I have a deficit, I need to close that deficit. I have a deficit, I need to close that deficit. Even in this very space, in this very moment, let's just say it's noisy, right? We have a need for it to be silent. So now there's a tension that's building up. The tension between the silence as a need and what the environment is dictating, right? And the idea is this, right? The question and challenge is, can you cultivate your mind enough so that these tensions and drives do not dominate you, do not hijack your brain, and do not take away your peace, right? And can to some extent, when you are met with tension, can you just actually learn to let it go, right? And accept it for what it is. And so long ago, and I've made this example before, right? Long ago, when these lectures have been happening, and there's been disturbances, how often have they gotten under your skin, right? How often have they stolen and robbed your peace? But then the question and challenge becomes, can you cultivate your mind enough to understand and accept the context, right? And then just let go from there. So, first noble truth, life is suffering. There's a lot of truth to it, right? And sure, coining it as complete suffering may be dramatic. However, a series of micro sufferings over time means you have a lifetime of suffering anyway. So at any given moment, you're in a state of suffering, right? So, I want to dive into the second piece, because the end result of this lecture, the idea is very powerful, right? We had to build up to it. So, suffering has a source, and it's a result of attachment, okay? But it grows beyond that. On the physical level, you can see, We have a certain level of suffering that we experience. And then as you dig and investigate, you understand that there's also like a psychological, social, and mental level of suffering, right? But the true source of the suffering is, if it's a matter of fact that if you're thirsty, you have to go find water. If you're hungry, you have to find food. If you're cold, you have to find clothing and shelter. That's not really suffering. It's just a matter of fact, right? The real source of suffering, however, does come from cravings and attachments to things that are, to some extent, man-made. Because if you think about it, let's just say animals, right? If they're hungry, they eat. Great. If they're cold, they'll seek shelter. Great. Are they necessarily in a state of suffering, or are they just merely existing, part of nature, right? So human beings are the same way. But there's something very interesting, which is what's existing in our very nature and things that have been created / man-made, right? And here's what I'm talking about. Yes, we need food to survive. Great. But then all of a sudden, we have, for example, people who become picky about the type of food that they eat, right? And how it has to be at a certain level of creation. And then you have gourmet and fine dining and all that stuff, right? That people become entitled to some extent. It's like, I want the very best, right? And so the question is, that level between need and craving, when you cross that line, what happens? All of a sudden you cross into the line of attachment, right? And so we become attached to certain things that are very interesting. Food, clothing, money, video games, drugs, anything that's like dopamine inducing, right? It's been created in our minds. Those are the types of attachment that creates true suffering on the physical level for our bodies, right? Even like social media. Like opening up your phone, seeing a text message, seeing an email. It feels good in the moment, but what you become attached to is that neurotransmitter release, right? And then, that's on the first level. The second level is the social and psychological levels of attachment that we become attached to. First and foremost, something very, very deep in Buddhism that very few people understand is that we begin to become attached to our notion of self. This claim to our identity, this singular I, me. And this is unfortunately what the programming creates. The programming of society creates. Which is basically saying, hey, you are Y-O-U, are a unique person, and that you are separate from this world. You are special. You are not part of this world. You are an observer of this world. But that's not true. Because to be an observer of this world, you have to be part of this world too. Right? And it's often forgotten. And as a result, people become attached to the notion of self as a separate entity. And therein creates more tension, more unsatisfactoriness, more suffering. How so? The idea is this, right? If you are separate from this world, if you are a unique person, all of a sudden, you treat your own viewpoints, your own beliefs, your own opinions and expectations as the most important thing. It's me and everyone else. Therein creates suffering, especially if you are attached to this idea that you are a unique special person in this world, right? And it's oftentimes what the messages that society tries to push out, right? But I think the point of Buddhism is to release you from that attachment to that idea. That in fact, before you are you, the special version of yourself, you are first and foremost a human being. You are one with this earth. And if you are able to achieve that level of understanding, then you're able to actually release yourself from a certain state of suffering. Second, beyond viewpoints, right? Beyond this attachment to your own selves, we're also attached to certain rites and rituals, rules and routines, and our own habits, right? How often do we do something automatically without ever actually being consciously aware, hey, I'm doing something. I'm aware that I'm doing something, right? That awakening requires you to come into the present moment, to connect your body and your mind to be one, right? It takes training, it takes cultivation. And oftentimes, we do things, A, out of autopilot, and B, because our mind gets hijacked by it, right? Finally, the last thing is, beyond being attached to who you are and your own identity, your identity gets wrapped with who you associate yourself with. So your relationship with other people defines your own identity. For example, the second you're born into a family. That family gives you an identity because you're bounded by your own last names. You're bounded by those relationships. And then you have other physical markers. For example, just your own identity being Asian, right? That's already something that you have a relationship with and to some extent you're attached to. Being male or female, right? Whatever the identifying marker is, to some extent you've become attached to it. Imagine if somebody went up to you on the street and called you something else that you weren't. Hey, instead of being female, you're male. And instead of being male, you're female. All of a sudden, you're like, it's very jarring, right? When people place you in certain markers that you know that you're not. And guess what? You have a need to defend yourself. You have a need to be responsive to that. And guess what that creates? Suffering, right? And so, we have two levels of the causes of craving, right? One's on a very visceral bodily level. Basic drives. If you're thirsty, you're going to seek water. If you're hungry, you're going to seek food. If you're cold, you're going to seek clothing and shelter, right? But then, if you're in need of dopamine, then you seek other substances, right? These are man-made creations. You seek the chemicals that your brain pumps out via neurotransmitters, right? This is why we are on our phones so often. This is why we play video games. This is why people seek drugs. This is why people seek alcohol, right? That's on a visceral level. But on the social factor level as well, right? We have all these things. Feelings of inadequacy. That's real. Feelings of loneliness. Feelings of envy. Resentment. All the negative types of feelings in life. And then feelings of all the positive ones. Feelings of compassion. Feelings of kindness. And happiness for others, right? All these things create cravings. And we are particularly attached to them, right? And so, oftentimes, and I broached this piece of conversation earlier, but the question is, how do we respond to our attachments and our cravings? Two things. Well, yeah. The first thing is this. On the positive note, if you have a craving or an attachment, what is it that we end up doing? We consciously or unconsciously try to satisfy it, right? So, on the one hand, it could be autopilot. Oftentimes, you walk to the kitchen, you grab a sandwich or something, and you didn't even know that you were doing it. That's autopilot, right? But we're driven towards it because our body said, hey, you are hungry, go eat. Great. But then on the conscious level, if you have an attachment or craving, you're striving towards your goals, okay? So, and sometimes when you're striving and you don't get it, what happens, right? And so the real piece of stuff, the point of Buddhism is not to say, oh, don't have goals, don't strive for them. It's the question of what happens when you get denied or rejected, right? What happens when you're not feeling success in life? What is it that you feel, right? Well, let's go through some of these examples, right? What happens when your ego gets threatened? Think about it. Every day, people get insulted, right? What happens when people call you certain names, right? Or make you feel embarrassed or ashamed? There's a certain conflict that arises in you, right? A certain type of anger, right? A need to defend yourself, right? What happens when your viewpoints are rejected? Let's just say you want to go hang out with your friends and your parents say no. What is it that you feel? A certain sense of anger, right? And then again, conflict starts boiling. What happens when the things that you want in life you can't obtain? Let's just say you want money. Let's just say you need like $1,000 to buy a new computer, but you can't get it. You start feeling frustrated. Like that sense of frustration boils, okay? And so, really, I like how a lot of Buddhism is repetitive, but it also is every time you return back to it, you see something new. A lot of the anger that you experience in life are due to conflicts, right? But really the source of this anger and frustration and conflicts come from attachment to things, attachment to your own self. And so, not being educated about these things is the real poison. And this is what Buddhism tries to eradicate. Can you be enlightened enough to understand that your body and your mind is constantly being poisoned? It's being poisoned from being too attached to things. And the challenge that Buddhism challenges every one of you guys is to ask yourselves, can I choose to let go? To not be attached, especially when I'm in the height of anger, right? And so, and here's the payoff, right? Here's the solution that Buddhism espouses. And then this is the best part about everything, right? First, Buddhism talks about the end of suffering as pursuing the middle path, right? There's a way to end suffering. You don't need to get to pursue everything to the fullest extent. Sure, you could want money, but you can't be greedy. Sure, you could seek success, but to what extent? You don't have to destroy and sacrifice everything in the process, right? So the idea is moderation. That's what the middle path is saying. Should you seek what you want to seek, but walk down the middle path, you won't be in nearly as in a large state of suffering as you think. Secondly, just remember that if you find yourself in a state of suffering, ask yourself, what are you attached to? What are you craving? And therefore, that teaches you to step back and say, oh, maybe I can respond differently to this. And if I do, I won't be in a state of suffering. And here's the last thing and the most important thing. You want to develop practices of fullness, which is oftentimes we are seeking and craving and becoming oftentimes frustrated, angry, etc., because we are seeking a deficit. We're seeking to fulfill a deficit. But the practice of fullness says this. The challenge is to change your viewpoint, shift your perspective and say, what if I don't have any deficits? What if I'm already full in this current moment? Do I necessarily have to be seeking? Do I necessarily have to be driven by the drives that I have? And so the practice of gratitude allows you to feel full and not in a deficit. Oftentimes, when we are in our state of suffering, we don't see what we have. We only see what we don't have. And the idea is you can easily shift that by simply shifting your perspective. And when you shift your perspective, you're actually able to let go. Here's the last thing, which is the lack of awareness of our bodies and our minds being in a reactive mode leads us down this path in a state of suffering, right? So we're constantly thinking about what we don't have. And our bodies are constantly rattled and depleted. And it leads to a vicious cycle, right? Not having something leads you to not doing anything about it, which leads to saying, oh, I don't have something, blah, 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 right? That's a reactive mode. When you shift your brain, you're able to shift it towards a responsive mode, right? When you feel resourced, when you feel like you have a sense of fullness, all of a sudden your capabilities come back to you and you're able to move through difficult situations, right? And you feel more confident, more grateful. When you're in that state, you're no longer in reactive mode, right? You're in a state of peace, contentment. And to some extent, that's the goal, the end of suffering, right? All right, that's it for this lecture. Thank you so much. That's it.